Monday, March 21st. Hi, everyone. This is Talkback. It's Monday, March 22nd, 2021, and we're in the middle of Women's History Month, celebrating women throughout history and the importance in our culture. Why do we need a Women's History Month? Do we have a Men's History Month? Why is it that throughout history, women have been unrecognized for their feats, for their adventurism, for their courage, for their ideas in many ways? We have the perfect guest to help us answer these questions and to help us celebrate some special women throughout history. I have Dr. Jennifer Reisinger.
Yeah.
Hi, Jennifer. It's
Hi.
great to see you.
Hi.
Jennifer is a professor of comparative literature in the humanities department at San Jose State University in California. So welcome. The beauty of StreamYard. We can talk to you from thousands of miles away. It's terrific.
Thank you so much. And thank you also to Public Access TV for making this possible. And yes, there are some advantages to our strange COVID era, and long distance communication is one of them. It's great to see you, Sheila.
Right. And I know before we get started, you're going to answer my question. Why do we need a Women's History Month? We don't need a Men's History Month. But before that, you told me you wanted to say something particular about what's going on in the world today.
Right. We're talking at a very difficult moment in women's history because of the rampant and obvious violence against women and against Asian Americans that we saw last week with the murder spree at the massage parlors in Atlanta. And, you know, one of the areas in which I specialize is in the study of Prudence Crandall, who's going to be well known to your viewers in Eastern Connecticut. And everyone knows that she closed her school after a particularly vicious, violent attack upon the building in September of 1834. But what a lot of people don't know is that earlier in that same year, in July of 1834, there were vicious anti-abolitionist riots in New York City. And there were African-American sex workers who were raped during those riots. We don't know what their eventual fate was. We don't even know their names. But the idea of sexualized racist violence must have been terrifying to both the students and Crandall and her allies in Canterbury, and was probably part of the reason that they closed the school. And I also think that very few people are aware that some of the abolitionists after the Civil War took up the cause of Asian American immigrants, in particular Chinese immigrants, who are being disenfranchised, who are being kicked out of cities throughout the Western United States, where most of them were immigrants. And that included William Lloyd Garrison, who called it for what it was. He says this is the same spirit that tried to stop us from freeing the slave or allowing immigrants from Ireland in an earlier era. And Cora Hatch, who was a feminist, a white woman, and a leader of the spiritualist movement, she said United States had no claim to a perfect democracy, given that it had enslaved one race, was attempting to keep out another in the Chinese Americans, was denying citizenship rights to half of its citizens, women, and was at that point in the 1860s trying to exterminate Native Americans. So the idea that we need to bring together all of these oppressions, and we're seeing that again right now, is so important. And so I think it's also important to see that right now we have this moment. The women who founded the Black Lives Matter movement, it was all women who were the founders of it back in 2014-15. And now we have a Black and Asian American woman vice president. First time a woman has been in the direct elected line to the presidency. Plus, the third in line for the presidency is also a woman in Speaker Pelosi, a white woman from my own area of San Francisco. So we have here a moment when we can see that these struggles are not new, but we can connect to that history and gain strength from the fact that others have seen these connections.
Right.
So thanks for allowing me to add that. I just think
it's important
to address our moment.
Right. And you did even leave out the other oppression of the Asian Americans being incarcerated in concentration camps in America during World War II, because they were supposed to be enemy aliens. That's part of our legacy too.
And this is why we need to be constantly examining ourselves and our own country. But it's also to answer your question of why we need a Women's History Month, because so much of the very inspiring history of women's activism has been left out of our textbooks. The idea that women are representative of half the human race is often lost. You wouldn't know that from sampling our textbooks or sampling our history.
Right.
We don't yet have a holiday that celebrates an important American woman. We have nothing to celebrate suffrage. We just went through the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, but we don't really have a national day to celebrate that achievement.
Interesting. Yeah. It reminds me, Jennifer, thinking about speaking with you, going through my education, let's say junior high school, who were the women that we knew about? Well, we knew about Joan of Arc. We knew about Helen of Troy. In American history, it was Betsy Ross. And then you got to be famous if you were the wife of a president, like Abigail Adams or Dolly Madison, right?
Yes.
When it came to suffrage, we hear Susan B. Anthony, but she was in the beginning, and she wasn't the most important, actually, as suffrage became to be realized in 1920. There were so many others, but we only have her name. And who else? In civil rights, we do remember on the bus, we do remember her, right?
Rosa Parks. Yeah.
Rosa Parks. But certainly not enough. And so much of history seems to be the men and the kings and the queens and the upper classes and the royalty and governments, without really getting down into what the people are doing and the culture underneath the top layer. So talk about that and why we need to change that and how we can.
Well, as you just said, so much of what we learn is about those people who were in structural positions of power, a king or a president or a senator or a general or a CEO, right? These are the people we hear about. But if one group of people, whether it be women, as in this particular case, or people of any given race, are excluded from even ever participating in those structures, they will never rise to a position where they will be remembered. So, as of right now, we're on this is the 46th president, and they've all been men. And there's a reason for that, which is that women couldn't even run prior to 1920, and we have not yet had a woman elected president, even though one did win a presidential election, but not in the Electoral College. So this is a case where what we talk about was structural racism or structural sexism. This is what it means. It's not that there was some one man in control who was making sure to keep women out. It was that the whole structure was set up to keep women out. And so in order to understand the place of women in history, you have to look somewhere other than in the obvious place. And the deeper you get back into history, the harder that is, because kings always kept family records. Governments always keep minutes of their proceedings and publish those. It's harder. You have to look in the interstices, those in-between places to find the names of women, to find the activities of women.
Right.
And you have to look harder. It's essentially social history instead of simply being political history.
Right. So before we get to the black and white women of the abolitionist movement, let's talk about something you and I mentioned before we went on air about the recent newspaper article about Jewish women of the resistance who had the most unbelievably courageous stories of what they did to resist the Nazis, the actions that they took to that threatened their own lives, and who are largely unknown. What is your comment on that?
Again, what we're dealing with here is a situation where resistance was absolutely necessary, and the women who undertook that role, Jewish women who undertook the role of trying to fight against the Nazi power, were dealing with so many layers of being hidden, right? That they can't be open about what they're doing at the time that they're doing it. Many of them died, were essentially martyrs in the cause. And so their records get lost in a way that the men who were able to gain access to the press or to history, to getting their name written into history, they're in a different situation. But what we find often, and what I was picking up in that particular piece of that we shared, is that women know that they're going to be underestimated by their opponents. Women consistently know that they can use patriarchy's own ignorance against it, and can use oppression's ignorance against it. It's like, oh, well, she's a girl, she can't do anything. And so that actually gives you greater freedom to act, because you know they're not watching you as carefully as they might be watching a higher profile male. And so, for instance, there is the example of Hannah Sens, who was able to actually, she had herself sent into German territory, where she conducted a few rescue missions and propaganda missions successfully before she was captured. And again, because she was a woman, she had some cover to be able to penetrate further into Nazi-held territory than maybe a man would have. A man who would have been presumed in that age group to be a combatant.
Right.
So I'm always amazed by how women can use the power of the patriarchy against it, like the martial art form of jujitsu, where you take the energy of your opponent that's coming at you and you turn that against the opponent. Yeah. That there's a kind of activist jujitsu that women are able to do. That doesn't mean you're successful 100% of the time, whether in jujitsu or in fighting oppression, but it's a strategy we see often. And the only way that we can make sure that this erasure doesn't happen is what we're doing right now, is that we talk about these names, we put them out there, we share what we know, and we don't allow ourselves to be hidden from history any longer.
Right. What an excellent point you made about women using the patriarchal powers. And I think even up to now in history, men have not had their consciousness raised enough to know that that can happen to them. I mean, isn't that the problem, the imbalance in consciousness between so many women who have been more enlightened in their capabilities and their courage in life, and the men we've left them behind, many of them. Isn't that part of the problem?
Well, and it is part of the problem. I'll say this, that right now I'm very heartened by the fact that a lot of white people are taking seriously the call to unlearn their racism and to become genuinely anti-racist. This is one of the best things I've seen in the last 2 years. But we need the corresponding movement on the gender side so that men will be unlearning their sexism. And I think the Me Too movement started some of that, but I think it also invoked a knee-jerk fear response on the part of a lot of men about their previous behavior, instead of leading to a sense of, I'm going to change, I'm going to reform, I'm going to get better. And I'm going to listen to women. I don't think we've seen that sufficiently yet. I know there's men out there doing it, but I don't think it's yet a cultural movement. And that's as important for men to do as I believe it is important for me as a white woman to be thinking about anti-racism.
Exactly. Well, as a woman, I've always felt that was a failure of the women's movement to bring men along with them. And with the Me Too movement, there are many men who are treating themselves as victims of the movement instead of people who need to join it.
Right.
And I think that we have a ways to go. But let's go back to our the topic of today, which are the Black and white women abolitionists. So again, my learning through high school, even college, we have Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, and then maybe Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, and that's about it. So give us a primer on the abolitionist movement in the 1800s.
Okay, so the abolitionist movement, in terms of calling for the immediate abolition of slavery, doesn't really get started until the 1820s. In a sense, African American communities had always been in favor of immediate abolition, because the opposite of immediate abolition is gradual abolition, that usually involves paying back the slave owners for the loss of their property. And the big change that happened among those who were trying to fight slavery in the white community was when they realized that if slave owning is wrong, and essentially, in using Christian terminology, a sin, then you shouldn't get recompensed for stopping doing it. If I am committing the crime of shoplifting on a habitual basis, to get me to stop, you don't say, okay, we'll get you to stop by giving you $100 gift card to Walgreens. No, that's not the way to do it. You simply make the right and wrong argument and say you need to stop shoplifting now. And this was the argument that was made, that if in fact slave owning was a sin, it needed to stop right away, with no recompense to the slave owners, but rather to those who had been wrongfully enslaved. And so that shift happens starting in the 1820s. It happens in both England and the United States, and women are in the forefront from the beginning. And this is the first time that we see a major social movement in which women are not just in the forefront of the people out in the streets protesting, but are in the forefront of thinking about it. So this to me is vital. And then in the 1830s, I've already mentioned Prudence Crandall, and I'll mention her again because I can't help myself. But this is when we also get the Grimke sisters, the first women to give a series of public speeches on the anti-slavery cause. But they had been preceded by a Black woman, Maria Stewart, who was actually the first woman in America of any race to give a political speech to a mixed audience of men and women, Black and white, which she did in 1832.
Wow. Would this be a good time to turn to our PowerPoint?
Let's turn to the slides, and because I love these. I love these women, and there are a few men in the show too, but I do love them for what they have given me in terms of support from our past. So yeah, go ahead and bring up that PowerPoint.
Do you see it?
Yes. I have a quote there from W.E.B. Du Bois, who referred to the activity of women in the abolition movement, but also of both men and women who came from the North to help teach the freedmen after the Civil War as the finest thing in American history. And I think, as usual, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a great historian as well as a wonderful activist, has pointed the way to the future. And the other thing that's vital here is that working on the abolition of slavery helped both Black and white women to articulate their own oppression and start the movements for women's rights.
Right. So there's a connection between the suffrage movement and the abolition.
Oh, absolutely. It's in some way, you could see it as parent to child, with the abolition movement being the parent, or you could see it as older sister to younger sister, with the older sister being the abolition movement. So in the 1820s, we had two things happening, two things about media. And, this is so easy for us to understand now because we live in an era of very fast media change. And there were two important newspapers that started in the 1820s. One, which has my favorite newspaper title of any journalistic publication, The Genius of Universal Emancipation, was published by a Quaker who was a white man, Benjamin Lundy. And he published the work of a woman I'm going to describe in a moment, Elizabeth Hayrick. And he also hired two co-editors for his paper. One was a man, William Lloyd Garrison, who goes on to become the leader of the immediate abolition movement in the United States, but also a white woman, Elizabeth Margaret Chandler. And at the same time that Lundy's paper is gaining traction, independent Black newspapers begin with a newspaper called Freedom's Journal. This was started in New York City by a minister, Samuel Cornish, who would later go on to become an endorser of Prudence Crandall School. Go on to the next one, please. And in 1827, Freedom's Journal published an editorial from a Black woman. And she begins, "Will you allow a female to offer a few remarks upon a subject that you must allow to be all important? I don't know that if in any of your papers you have said sufficient upon the education of females. I hope you are not to be classed with those who think that our mathematical knowledge should be limited to fathoming the dish kettle, and that we have acquired enough history if we know that our grandfather's father lived and died. 'Tis true the time has been when to darn a stocking and cook a pudding well was considered the end and aim of a woman's being, but those were days when ignorance blinded men's eyes. The diffusion of knowledge has destroyed those degraded opinions, and men of the present age allow that we have minds that are capable and deserving of culture. There are difficulties and great difficulties in the way of our advancement, but that should only stir us to greater efforts." When I read this out loud, I am struck by how current the content is. Obviously, the style is 19th century.
Right.
But the content, what you and I were just discussing, Sheila, right? Which is the fact that the men are not picking up on women's rights and women's dignity and women's education.
Right.
But she still asks permission. Will you allow a female to offer a few remarks? We don't ask permission anymore. We just go right forward. Yeah. But really, this is a remarkable moment in 1827, a remarkable first blast of the trumpet of women's freedom.
Now,
go on.
Where is she from? Where is Matilda from?
She was in New York City, but so far scholars have been unable to trace who she was. We don't have the full subscriber rolls to Freedom's Journal, and even that might not tell us who it was, because in those days, a lot of African Americans would only have the paper read out loud to them rather than having their own copy. Go ahead. I have a little bit more from Matilda because she's just so great. I'm quite fond of her. And so she then says, we may not have all the advantages that white women have, but we can certainly do more. And then she says, look, we have an influence over our sons, over our husbands. And so this, I won't read the whole thing out loud here, but she says, we have to teach our sons and we have to teach our daughters so that they teach their sons. Right. So these were examples of how women tried to be respectable and fit into their patriarchal culture at the same time that they wanted access to knowledge.
Right.
But here you can also see that Matilda is not only worried about those of her race who are enslaved, she is worried about free Black women and about women in general getting access to education. So it doesn't end. The abolition movement never was only about ending slavery. It was also about trying to address racism. And look, here we still are trying to do it.
In much of the slavery institution, you were not allowed to teach Black kids, right?
This is true. And after some important slave uprisings in the 1820s and 1830s, you were even forbidden to teach African Americans who were enslaved how to read or even have a copy of the Bible. And so even in their Christian education, they were denied the literacy that is the great gift of Protestant Christianity to human civilization, the idea that everyone should have access to reading. And yet that was denied.
Yeah.
So Elizabeth Hayrick is the first white person to articulate the full logic of immediate abolition in print. She was a British Quaker. She was active in many, many causes, including labor causes and causes that dealt with animal cruelty and so on. But she says that everything that proponents of slavery say is wrong with African Americans is all a consequence of slavery. And so she says, remove the cause and the effect will cease.
Yeah.
Give the slave his liberty in the sound name of justice. Give it to him at once. While you hold him in bondage, you will profit little from your plans of amelioration.
You know, Jennifer, I've often wondered, what is the connection with the abolitionists and their thinking on how to counter the economic imperative that was slavery to keep the South economically viable? I mean, that was a part of it, wasn't it? Obviously.
That was a part of it. And not in this first set of abolitionists in the 1830s and 1840s, very few of them were sophisticated in their economic thinking. They didn't have a full plan, but they were very much in favor of paying the workman for his work.
Yeah.
And this was a principle that the Quakers had long held. And it's what led that denomination to be the first to outlaw slaveholders in their own denomination, which is that they had a biblical passage. I'm sorry, I can't recall the passage off the top of my head. It may even be from the Hebrew Bible about that the workman must be paid for an honest day's work, that it's part of the ethical code. And so they believed that free enterprise and remunerated labor were the way to go. And they simply said that the South would do better if it had that form of labor. Now, it turns out that, again, I think that from the viewpoint of formal economics, that was a little naive, but the moral imperative was to end injustice, not to save the South.
Right, of course. Yeah.
But that was going to slow down the politicians, right, who do have to be concerned about that. That being said, those politicians were all white men.
Right. And so at the same time, all of this was going on in the development of the thinking of anti-slavery, the government was grappling with decisions about what state to enter as free, as slave, or the Missouri Compromise, all the things that really, in a way, led to the Civil War, because we just couldn't go on letting states in as slave states and other states as free. It wasn't possible to keep the Union going. So is there a connection between that political end and what was happening government-wise with the thinking as we went along through the 1800s?
Well, again, this is a place where women had, and African Americans had, both a disadvantage and an advantage. They're not invited to those discussions. They're not invited to those political debates. And when those political debates happen and women try to enter them through petitions, and these were largely white women who would submit petitions to Congress, their anti-slavery petitions were tabled. They were essentially not listened to. And so what happens instead is that white women and black men figure out other ways to try to be political, which is to raise their voices, to enter into history on their own terms rather than through the government apparatus. That being said, that government, those government decisions, those political decisions form the structure.
Sure.
They form the structure that is going to dominate large chunks of the economy, as you say, of international relations. So, for instance, during the Civil War, the Confederate States were consistently trying to woo Great Britain over to their side on the basis of giving Britain advantages in the cotton market. And they're part of the discussion, but to me, they're not nearly as interesting as the agency exercised by women and by African Americans.
Okay. Jennifer, those who advocated for gradual abolition, what did they mean by that? Letting the slave population just die out? And how would that work?
Gradual abolition, as the mushy middle ground, occupies a huge part of the spectrum. One idea of gradual abolition was to set a date when slavery would end in a location, and just to have it end then. And this is what happened in New York State, for instance, where slavery ended in the late 1820s. It ended on a 4th of July. And that was the day that Sojourner Truth was no longer a slave, for instance. But this was, it set up an odd dynamic where you're kind of counting the days till you gain your freedom. But it also led to the people who were enslavers thinking, oh, I better sell my enslaved people before they all just go free and I don't get anything back. So that wasn't a perfect system. Then there was also the scheme of colonization, which was the idea that African Americans who were free would go back to Africa and settle over there and bring the benefits of Christianity to the pagans of Africa. And this was an effort that was largely funded and propagated by whites, including Francis Scott Key, author of the Star-Spangled Banner, Bull Rod Washington, the nephew of the first president, and James Monroe, the 5th president of the United States, after whom the capital of Liberia, Monroeville, is named. And this movement was highly insulting to African Americans because many of them did not want to leave. They had never been to Africa. It would be as if you told me I was going to be shipped back to the homeland of my parents and grandparents and great grandparents. I've never been to the Netherlands. I wouldn't know what to do there, right? You know, and so, but it was. There were so this was another plan for gradual abolition, but the African Americans also pointed out that this would be used as a way to get rid of the most militant among the enslaved, that it would be a way to get rid of troublemakers, but that it would also become a block to African Americans ever being able to reach equality and parity in the United States. And I was just reading the other day about a young Black man who had applied to medical school in New York City in this time period in the 1830s. And he was told that he could only enroll in the medical school if he promised to move to Liberia when his degree was complete.
Wow.
And he refused. He said, I'm not going to do it. But he never did fulfill his dream of becoming a doctor.
Wow. Okay. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So I mentioned Elizabeth Margaret Chandler. She was a poet, and she became the co-editor of the anti-slavery newspaper, and then later moved to Michigan, where she set up the first anti-slavery organization in that state. And she was, and it was a female anti-slavery society. And this was, unfortunately, she died very young, as you can see, or her name would be better known to the public. Go ahead. And then William Lloyd Garrison, who I mentioned, obviously a white man, he becomes the editor of the Liberator and really the standard bearer for immediate abolition in the entire period leading up to the Civil War. But a lot of people don't know that he has a strong feminist background, that he was one of the younger children of a couple who lived in Newburyport, in Massachusetts. Uh-huh. And his father was a seaman, and so his father would come into port once a year, meet the baby who had been born while he was gone, and impregnate the mother again, and then be off to sea. And at some point, he simply decided it wasn't worth coming home. And so he's what we would call a deadbeat dad.
Ah,
And young William Lloyd grew up watching his mother do everything possible to keep her family together and fed, to stay out of sex work, which was obviously always available, but his mother didn't want to do that for her from her own moral code. And so Garrison was ready to listen when women began to speak. And that's really important. We touched on it earlier, Sheila. What does it take for men to realize that women are fully equal partners in everything that is being done in society? And
right.
Garrison had grown up as a sensitive youth and watched and understood.
Yeah.
And so to me, he's a pro-feminist hero among men.
Right.
Go ahead. So 1831 is this first year when every major group is participating in politics despite not being able to vote. So white men, white women, black men, black women, but also at the same moment, Native Americans were becoming active, because this is when the Trail of Tears is being litigated before the removal starts. So we have really every major ethnic group that was, or racial group rather, that was here, and men and women from those groups working together. And this is going to create a new world. Go ahead. So the specific events, Garrison started his newspaper. There was a black man, David Walker, whose writings had been written in 1829, but Garrison republished them in his new newspaper. There was a major black slave revolt in Virginia, Nat Turner's revolt. And Maria Stewart, a black woman, had her first essays published in the Liberator. She's the one who will give the first public speech.
Right.
And Garrison personally went after Lydia Maria Child, who was the Martha Stewart of her day, a very good novelist, but also a writer of advice books and things like that. And she joined with Garrison. So he had one of the best women writers of his generation on his staff from the very beginning. So that's incredible. Now, to come back to one of your earlier questions, Sheila, how many people know any of this?
Right.
Right. And this, and again, it's not because I'm smarter than other people. That's not it at all. It's that this, we're all victims of a cover-up.
Right.
That this knowledge, we all know Jackson, he's on the $20 bill, maybe not for much longer.
Yeah.
But,
well, I know Nat Turner because of William Styron's wonderful book.
Mm-hmm.
So I know about the Nat Turner Rebellion.
Right, exactly. But the fact that these events are happening simultaneously, and that white people are listening to African Americans, maybe for the first time, and that men are listening to women, I wouldn't say in this case for the first time, but for one of the first times, certainly one of the first modern times. And that's really a magical moment in American history, to be able to say, wow, it's all converging. And where is it converging? On what it would mean for slavery to end. And then the corollary, what would it mean for racism to end? And then the corollary, what would it mean for sexism to end?
Well, these intellectual and political ideas and the cooperation you talk about here, didn't it percolate up to the decision makers, to the congressmen and senators?
They were pretty resistant at the higher political levels. There are a few exceptions. For instance, John Quincy Adams undertakes the defense of the Amistad captives at the level of Congress, and there are a few other radical Congress people. But it isn't really until the 1850s and 1860s that you get the really outstanding ones like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, for whom the Sumner Tube is named up in Boston. Those of you who've had to go through it at some point, I know you get stuck in the Sumner Tube, but when you're there, think about Charles Sumner, one of the greatest senators in American history. So it does take a long time, and quite frankly, the message of women doesn't percolate up in this era. It takes everything just to get slavery ended and to get equal rights enshrined in the Constitution.
Well, I know we've talked before in discussing the suffrage movement. We've talked before about how disappointed the suffrage adherents were when, after the Civil War, blacks got the right to vote, but only men, not women. And it took another, 70 years to bring about suffrage for women in this country.
Right.
So, absolutely.
Yeah. And at the same time, no sooner had African Americans gotten the right to vote nationwide than that was compromised and vitiated really by the Jim Crow laws and the end of Reconstruction.
Right. And we're revisiting Jim Crow now, sadly, in the rash of bills that are being put forward in 43 of our 50 states to try and limit the right to vote. I mean,
it's crazy. Any attempt to limit the right to vote should simply be seen as un-American and undemocratic and regressive. I heard someone refer to it as Jim Crow with cologne.
Exactly.
Definitely what it feels like.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, everything we're talking about today is not just buried for me in the history of the 1830s.
Right.
It's part of an ongoing set of activities and problems that we have in the United States.
Right.
All right. So let me see what I had up next. So yeah, we get these female anti-slavery societies. Women started organizing their own independent anti-slavery societies. And by the way, this is included in Connecticut, where in Brooklyn, Connecticut, and Eastern Connecticut, there was a female anti-slavery society. There was also one in Middletown. And there was also an African-American temperance group, women's temperance group in Middletown. So many of these female anti-slavery societies, though, were all white women, but there were exceptions in major urban areas, Boston, Salem, Massachusetts, and Philadelphia being three of those areas. And there were two conventions of anti-slavery women, one held in New York in 1837 and another one in 1838. And both of these had both black and white women. The 1838 one was meant to be the first anti-slavery meeting held in this beautiful hall in Philadelphia called Pennsylvania Hall. And the building, it was quite literally the first major meeting held there. But instead, this building was attacked because of the women meeting in it and mixing black and white, and there were men who attended the women's meeting also. So it was considered a promiscuous assembly of men and women.
So that brings up the question about Free State of Pennsylvania. You're in Philadelphia. Why were the anti-abolitionists so powerful and important and getting mobs to attack these people in 1830?
Yes, and in fact, the building did not survive the meeting of the women. I just want to add that their first 2 days were held in the building, and the building was burned down after their second day. The other 2 days had to be held elsewhere.
So I guess my question is, how powerful were the anti-abolition forces in the free states like Pennsylvania?
Very. And some of it was economic. Some of it was the idea that this would hurt relations between Philadelphia and the South and therefore hurt trade and commerce. Yeah. Some of it was the idea that America was still, the United States was still a young experimental country, and that this would upset the delicate balance that those compromises you made reference to had maintained. And then there was the simple racism and jealousy of any privileges that African Americans would get.
Right. So our high school textbooks really don't tell us the truth about that. Everything is black and white. There are the free states, and they're anti-slavery, and then there are the slavery state. Well, not true, as you're
No, not true. And it changes gradually. You can kind of follow the barometer of public opinion, and it changes. But even in the 1850s, right before the Civil War, most whites in the North who were against slavery were still anti-black. They were still racist, but they just felt that slavery was either too morally compromised itself, or was simply no longer productive. and was holding down the wages of white workers.
Well,
So
being
Abraham,
anti-black, yeah. Even
yeah,
Lincoln, in some of his Gettysburg addresses, spoke disparagingly about the culture and education of blacks, didn't he?
mhm.
Even he did.
Yes. Oh, yeah. No, right, exactly. And Lincoln was also trying to work out colonization schemes either to Liberia or to Haiti as late as 1863
Yeah. Yeah.
before
And
he
again,
realized that that wasn't
yeah.
going to work. But now,
Again, glossed over in our high school history books.
although the CNN, the recent CNN show about Lincoln was honest about this, and I
Okay.
think on balance, Lincoln is someone who shows us what can happen when someone is open to changing their mind and making progress on these issues.
Right.
That Lincoln is not perfect. He's not the savior of African Americans. Any characterization like that is too simple. But he was a person in a position of political power who was able to hear the voices that were coming to him, including of African Americans, and he was able to change himself.
Right. Very important. Yes.
Mhm. We need to be able to do that. So
Solidarity.
that's right. The women who were meeting together when the attack started on the building on the second day of their conference, there were white women and black women. And one of the white women on the platform said, "We need to protect our colored sisters," because they knew that the violence of the mob would more likely fall on the black people than the white people. And so every white woman made sure that she had a black woman and they locked arms. And this kind of physical contact was particularly enraging to the mob, but they also knew that if they attacked a white woman, they would be in more trouble. And so it was an act of solidarity that worked. And sometimes we have to remember that we have to be there in a physical way for our sister.
Of course, that's amazing. That was 1838, and they were having the solidarity and locking arms. It took Eleanor Roosevelt to get Marian Anderson, a black singer, to sing at the Lincoln Memorial in the 1940s. Outrageous, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and another thing that many people don't know is that very soon after becoming president, Theodore Roosevelt, in an earlier generation, it was right in 1901 or 02, very soon after the assassination of McKinley, that Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to the White House for a dinner. And he was so excoriated for having allowed a black man to share the table at the White House that he never did it again. Even though you would have a hard time finding a more conciliatory African American figure than Booker T. Washington.
Yeah, and you would have a hard time finding a more stubborn and authentic and
exactly,
self-contained, self-centered president as Theodore Roosevelt. So how he was cowed by that is also unbelievable.
Exactly. It's unbelievable, and yet that's part of our history. Right. And in the same way that I just said that, with Lincoln, we can see someone who was making progress. I think that with our country, we can see that it is possible to make progress, but you only make progress by acknowledging that you've made mistakes.
Right.
I am an American. I claim that identity. And there's things in our history that I'm proud of. There's other things I'm embarrassed about. And there's things I'm angry about. But it's my responsibility as an American to be able to look at all of that.
Well, of course, after we finish the slides, I want you to weigh in on the whole idea of the 1619 project versus the 1776 and education. That's what we want to get to conclude your time here. Okay, let's keep going with this.
All right. Yeah, I have a couple more things. So actually, there's Good Prudence Crandall. And these are some constant themes that come up in American women's history. We already saw Matilda talk about access to education, the ability to define who you are on your own terms, and that your religion is not simply an external label, but it's part of your own practice, your own quest, that both men and women deserve their rights, whether they're married or not, and that within marriage, there are rights that each partner still has. And that we have to keep thinking about how differences emerge among women along lines of race and class. So again, Eastern Connecticut, very lucky to have a figure like Prudence Crandall who refracts all of these dimensions like a diamond.
Right. By the way,
Go ahead.
we have to
Yeah.
mention that you've written a book about Prudence Crandall and her school. And
Yep. It's out to the editors right now, and hopefully I can get publication information by sometime later. Next time you have me back, how's that?
Great, great.
And here's another example of what Crandall did. First of all, she had a very advanced curriculum for her Black students. She had reopened her school for the reception of young ladies and little misses of color, which were terms of respect that were rarely given to Black women at that time. She has a very advanced curriculum. Go ahead to the next slide. And she also was able to get, as endorsers for her school, 15 men, many of them reverends, as you can see on the list there.
Right.
But it's both Black and white, 8 Black men and 7 white men. But because of the structure of the time, there are no women on the list. Right? And that's because
she needed the men to.
She needed the men, and to have a woman on the list would have discredited the list in the eyes of people. And yet it's a woman teacher educating women, right? So go ahead. So a lot of what I'm talking about is connected to a feminist theory that Black women are largely the creators of, called intersectionality, which is the idea that we have interlocking identities. And this means that we are not known only by our race, but also by our gender, maybe our marital status, sexual orientation. But you have to always be considering these different identities, because I'm a woman all the time, I'm white all the time, I'm a lesbian all the time. I mean, it's not like I put on one identity at one time and others at another. Right. So for instance, with the crime that happened in Atlanta last week, we know that there was a gender element, but we are also fairly suspicious that there was a racial element, and rightly so, given that these were called Asian massage parlors, right? I mean, that these are indeed an interlocking identity. And to try to say it's all about gender or all about race, neither of those would be correct.
Right.
Right? And so here are some names just to keep you thinking and searching on your own. Lucretia Mott, who really is the one who most successfully bridges the abolitionist to women's rights movement.
Right. She was at Seneca Falls, right?
Right, exactly. She helped to organize that. She came from an earlier generation of activists, very much that wonderful Quaker tradition. She was a great public speaker. Sarah and Angelina Grimke were white women sisters whose family in South Carolina were enslavers. They grew up seeing the cruelties of slavery and wanted to distance themselves from it, and later became speakers. And Abby Kelly Foster was a white woman who led what was called the Come Outer movement, which was to leave any church that would not denounce slavery. Mm-hmm. And on the Black women's side, there was Julia Williams of Boston. She was a student at Crandall School. She was also a student at another mixed race educational venture in New Hampshire, in Canaan, where she met her future husband, Henry Highland Garnett. And she was one of the delegates to the first conference of anti-slavery women. Mm-hmm. Sarah Harris Ferryweather was the first student in Crandall School, Sarah Harris, and she later married a blacksmith. They lived in Rhode Island, right near the border with Connecticut, and their house was a regular station on both the Underground Railroad, but also as a visiting location for abolitionists. So they were.
Wasn't Sarah Harris from Norwich?
Yes, she was originally from Norwich, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, great Norwich woman. And Anna Remond Parker came from an important Black family, was an educator. Mariah Stewart, the woman speaker I mentioned before. Charlotte Forten, who became one of the Black abolitionists who went to the South to educate freed people. And you mentioned earlier Sojourner Truth. So go ahead. And I think the next one was of Charlotte Forten, who you see there as a younger woman. they were both Harriet Forten and James and Charlotte Forten were related to James Forten, who was an independently wealthy businessman in Philadelphia, African American, employed both Black and white workers at his sail making factory. And he educated his daughters, and his wife was also an educated woman, and the result was multi-generational activism. So I count Forten too among the pro-feminist men in this discussion.
Okay.
Yeah. And Mariah Stewart, who is, as I mentioned before, one of the very first women to ever speak before a mixed audience in the United States. And she said in her farewell speech of 1833, she said that we should not be astonished if God should raise up your own females to strive to stop the strong current of prejudice that flows against us at present. And that us that she says there, it's not clear if it's racially meant or meant in terms of gender. And I think that's because she already knew what I said about intersectionality. I see we're approaching time.
That's okay. We have time. Keep going.
Okay. So she also was brave enough, even though she was a very devout Christian, to speak against the source of much of the sexism in the New Testament, that being St. Paul. And she said, St. Paul said it was a shame for a woman to speak in public. And it was this biblical verse from the letter to Timothy that had kept women from public speaking for a long time. So she takes it head on and says, St. Paul said it was a shame for a woman to speak in public. Yet our great high priest and advocate, meaning Jesus, did not condemn a woman for a more notorious offense than this, meaning the woman caught in adultery. And then she says, if St. Paul but knew of our wrongs and deprivations, I presume he would make no objection to our pleading in public for our rights.
Great.
So she's just like, if Paul were here, I'd talk sense into him.
That's true.
I think it's an amazing moment.
Yeah.
The Grimke's, who I mentioned before. So I can go on to the next one. And Angelina Grimke wrote of a book, a pamphlet really, to the white women of the South, saying, popular opinion is that women are the moral conscience of the nation, so act that way.
Yeah.
End slavery, you know how bad it is. Sojourner Truth, with her own self-chosen name, that was her birth name was Isabella von Wagener, but that was the name of her enslaver, von Wagener. So she said, God told me to wander around and always speak the truth. And that's how she chose her name. She was subject to sexual abuse when she was enslaved, including from her the slave owner's wife. So it was one of these cases where trust and solidarity between white and Black women was not guaranteed. All right. And this, of course, from her famous 1851 speech. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. Well, I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. She's like, if this is about physical strength,
Sure.
Don't test me. Yeah.
Terrific. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's Sarah Harris Fairweather and the Fairweather House in Kingston.
Student, right?
Yep. And then Stanton and Mott, who were both active in the abolitionist movement, and they met at the World's Anti-Slavery Conference in London. And they met there because Stanton's husband was an abolitionist and he was invited, but then the women delegates were not allowed to be seated because the British didn't approve of women taking a visible political role. And so at that key moment, that attempt to exclude women brought together the two great minds from two different generations of Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. William Lloyd Garrison sat in the balcony with the women, as did Charles Raymond, who was the father of Anne Raymond. He was an African-American man. Two other white men also joined the women in the gallery and refused to participate. Right. Stanton must have worried about her marriage because her husband did not sit in the gallery.
Now, didn't Great Britain free the slaves before we did in America?
They did, and they were a little bit ahead of us on women's vote too. But What can I say? They were a little behind morally on women's full political participation at that time. And Frederick Douglass is another one of the great pro-feminist men. We all know his basic story. He escapes from enslavement, and he came to the attention of William Lloyd Garrison, became an anti-slavery speaker. Eventually, he had a break with Garrison, and because he felt that Garrison had become somewhat immune to really listening to blacks, and I think he was right on that. Go ahead to the next one, because Douglass, and this is just one of the great quotes: "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress." And that's as true along racial lines as it is along gender lines.
Right.
But he does go on to the next one. These are all great quotes, but I wanted to just say Frederick Douglass chaired parts of the Seneca Falls Convention. He was one of the men who knew that what the women were doing at Seneca Falls in 1848 was important. He was there and he participated.
Well, it's interesting that I also read about Seneca Falls that they talked about social equality, economic equality, and voting was not as big of an issue. And Frederick Douglass was one of those who advocated for them to take on suffrage as part of the final declaration at the Falls, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And unfortunately, there were not Black women in attendance.
Right.
And so the split that was going to happen between Black feminism and white feminism can be traced, unfortunately, to this moment. Now, what I hope I've showed you before is that it didn't have to be that way. The solidarity of those women at Pennsylvania Hall in 1838, just 10 years earlier, would point to the possibility that things could have been different.
Yeah, I guess. I see that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, that sounds good.
And those are the Declaration of Sentiments.
Right. So this was the final adoption of the platform of Seneca Falls, which is that men have established an absolute tyranny over women, and go on to the next one, which was that included the idea that men have put themselves in the role of God, and that he has led women to want to live this dependent life, and that women have not been allowed to pursue the full range of human options.
Right. This is really patterned after the Declaration of Independence, right. Only it's against the men culture rather than against the king.
That's correct. And a very important analysis. You had brought up about Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Yes, she is.
Or Uncle Tom's Cabin. And there's lots of problems with Uncle Tom's Cabin. It took Stowe a long time to work her way around to genuinely being in favor of abolition. And she still infantilized her Black characters and didn't see them as full actors. But the impact that she had on white women, remember how I mentioned Angelina Grimke had asked if women are the moral conscience of the nation, what are you going to do about it? So go to the next slide. This is just one scene from a time when there's a character, Mary Bird, whose husband is a senator. And the husband had voted in favor of the fugitive slave law, which essentially made it incumbent upon every white person in the North to participate in capturing Black people. And so Mary Bird says to her husband, "You ought to be ashamed. It's a shameful, wicked, abominable law, and I'll break it for one the first time I get a chance. And I hope I shall have a chance." I do. So they can see here a white woman saying, "I don't agree with this, and I'm my own person, and I'm my own political actor, and I will take the political action of housing a fugitive slave, even though my husband voted for that awful law."
Right, right.
And so even though this is fiction, the example was strong. And at the same time, Lydia Maria Child had worked with a woman who escaped slavery. Harriet Jacobs was the pen name that she took, and helped to write Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which was one of the most important of the slave testimonies that was ever published, and it included a very frank discussion of sexual abuse, but also of her own sexual choices.
Right. But she wasn't invited to the White House with Abraham Lincoln like
No.
Harriet Beecher Stowe was.
No, nor and Sojourner Truth also met Lincoln, but not Harriet Jacobs, because she had written openly about the fact that she had kept up an unmarried relationship with a white man as protection against her own master when she was trying to escape. And she also hid out for 2 years in a ceiling.
Wow.
And my last figure is Edmonia Lewis, who was a mixed race person. She had a Native American mother and an African American father. She was raised on Native ancestral land. She was one of those first women who got to attend college, Oberlin College in Ohio being the first college open to women and the first college open to African Americans. So she went there, and she became a sculptor. She later joined an expatriate community of American women artists in Rome, and there she was able to also live in her genuine sexuality as a lesbian. And her work is absolutely beautiful. Next slide. And very much in a neoclassical format, but it contained busts of some of the major figures of the 1860s. Mm-hmm. Robert Gould Shaw, who she knew personally, was the white leader of the first Black regiment in the Civil War, the Massachusetts 54th. And Abraham Lincoln, of course, we all know who he was. And she also did other figures that dealt with African-American mythological themes. And I love that photo of her. She's a beautiful woman.
Yeah.
And so if I've helped you in any way, here we've got going on the top row there, that's Harriet Jacobs, Lydia Mariah Child reading, as women should, Edmonia Lewis, and then down below, Mott, Anthony, and Stanton. And these women have created the world in which we live today. We owe them a lot. And if by bringing their names to the attention of more people, I've helped to celebrate Women's History Month, then my work here is done.
Right. Well, so that's terrific. And I get that concept of intersectionality that you're talking about. That really helps, because I think we study the suffrage movement, we study the abolition movement. You've connected them in a very cohesive way. That's very important. So we want to finish with talking about how we're going to educate our young people now to understand the value of these people you've talked about and how important they were to history. And along with that, I want you to comment on, it's really a controversy, I guess, the 1619 Project, which uses the first slave ship coming to America as the basis for our culture, our political culture, the slavery, the abolition, and so forth, versus people who decry that because they believe that is festering too much on America's ills, on America's problems, and not on America's glories. Give us your idea of that.
Well, I've been a very strong proponent of the 1619 Project since it started. We have a remarkable range of documentary evidence about the slave trade, about enslavement, and about the economic impact of slavery and of emancipation in the United States. And this does need to be shared. This is, to me, history is always about being honest about what happened. There's a certain amount of just, you have to do the documenting. Now, that being said, there are the kind of documents that we have are often painful. It's not a pretty history to look at. And when you start thinking about what it means to say that 3.5 million people were carted across the Atlantic against their will to be enslaved, when you realize what it means to say that there could be millions who drowned in the transatlantic slave trade, when you realize what it means to say that thousands of families were separated every year. When you start mounting up that human pain, to say that it would be better to ignore that is to make I think, a very poor moral decision, and to be running away from a full accounting. To my mind, there's no problem in celebrating some good things the country has done. But to celebrate only and to not look at the mistakes, you don't improve that way, right? I would never become a better musician or a better student if my professors just said, great, 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 let's celebrate how wonderful you are. Somebody had to tell me when I was making a mistake. And I think the idea that we can simply celebrate America's greatness without acknowledging America's mistakes and weak points is exactly the kind of character flaw we would not want in a human being. And therefore, we don't want it in this larger projection of who we all are. And it won't take a genius. In fact, I can see this change in my own students at the university. It doesn't take a genius to figure out, if you're celebrating all the great things, who got left out. You can't hide under the bushel of naive patriotism for very long. And the 1776 project is not naive patriotism, it's intentional cover-up. It's an intentional effort to celebrate at the cost of being honest. So I am very much a fan of not only the 1619 project, but the earlier project from the Hartford Courant of complicity, looking at how the North was complicit in slavery. Now available in book form.
So this has been terrific, Jennifer. But so my final question is, you're the scholar, you've presented all this wonderful historical evidence that you've collected and that we need to impart to our students as we learn history. So how does that translate into the schools? Through the boards of education, through the states, through textbooks? What's the mechanism for getting what you have imparted to us that's so important that we need to know to our younger generations so that they'll have the fuller understanding of our country?
Well, I'm happy to say that at the level where I teach in college, it is happening. For instance, my university is part of the larger California State University system, and we have now instituted an ethnic studies requirement for all students. So change is happening. But the real problem is, if you don't mind me coming back to this word, structural at the elementary and junior high and high school levels, because textbooks are often approved statewide. And the big states, Texas, California, New York, big states population-wise, they often get to make the decisions about which textbooks are going to be sold because they're going to generate the largest market. And the school boards and the boards that decide those are often not at the cutting edge of scholarship, but rather are in a more of a middle of the road position. Or some of them are, or you'll get a split. Some are in the 1619 project and some are in the 1776 project, right? So it's very hard to get the best new scholarship into the textbooks. But I often ask my college students, were you exposed to this in high school? Were you exposed to this at any point in your education, about all topics having to do with minoritized people? And I have noticed over the decades that the number of them who have at least a passing familiarity with these names has increased. But the number who don't is the more alarming one, right?
Right. So we have a lot of work to do. And
get
so
elected to school boards. If you are a person who wants history to tell the whole truth and not partial truths, get yourself elected to a school board.
All right. Good final thought. And again, thank you for bringing us so much information to help celebrate History Month. You have so much else to provide. I want to have another discussion with you about another another group of women in other phases of our intellectual lives, literature, art, philosophy. You've got it all in your repertoire, and we look forward to having you back again. Okay, Jennifer, it's always
Thank you
great
so
to have
much, Sheila. I've
you. All right,
enjoyed our
this has been great, and we'll see you all next time on Talk Back. Bye.